What if one of the most important medical breakthroughs of the 20th century, a discovery credited with saving tens of millions of lives, mostly children, was really just water, sugar, and salt, mixed in the right ratio, sitting quietly in scripture the entire time witut anyone noticing the connection? Picture a desert crossing thousands of years ago. A nation traveling for days, throats dry, coming across a pool of water they can't even drink because it's too bitter, or striking a rock in desperation because there's no water left at all anywhere nearby. Survival in that world depended on getting hydration right, not just finding water, but finding water the body could actually use and hold on to, a distinction that could mean the difference between life and death for an entire traveling community. That's exactly what modern medicine rediscovered in the 1960s and 70s. Plain water alone often isn't enough to rehydrate a body in real trouble. A small amount of sugar and salt alongside it helps the body absorb and hold on to fluid far more effectively than water by itself. A formula. The World Health Organization now considers one of the most significant medical advances of the entire 20th century. Quick note before we start. This video covers general hydration and electrolyte support, not medical treatment for dehydration caused by illness, which needs a doctor or an actual oral rehydration product. If you're on blood pressure medication, a diuretic, or manage kidney or heart disease, talk to your doctor before increasing your sodium or potassium intake. Let's count down 17 biblical drinks and drink recipes connected to electrolyte balance. Some straight from scripture, others modern recipes built from ingredients that already appear throughout it. Stay with me for number 5. Water. So bitter. People thought they'd die of thirst anyway, made drinkable by nothing more than a piece of wood. And for number 1, a drink recipe that maps almost exactly onto the exact formula doctors still use to save lives today. Let's start at number 17. Number 17. Cucumber water. Cucumbers are roughly 95% water, and that water carries a small but real amount of potassium along with it, making cucumber slices in water one of the gentlest ways to add a little flavor and a little mineral content to plain hydration without introducing anything overpowering to the taste. In Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites in the wilderness, tired of manna, after so many months of eating the same thing day after day, specifically cry out for the cucumbers they used to eat back in Egypt, remembered clearly enough to be named alongside melons, leeks, onions, and garlic on their list of foods they missed. It's a small, almost petty complaint tucked into a much larger story, yet specific enough to tell us exactly which foods actually stuck in people's memory after they were gone. Slice cucumber into a pitcher of water and let it sit for an hour or two before drinking. The modern version of this is essentially spa water, though the Israelites would have simply eaten the cucumber itself rather than infusing it separately the way it's often served today. From a vegetable people missed enough to complain about in the middle of the wilderness, let's move to a grain turned into a drink through a very different kind of preparation entirely. Number 16. Barley water. Barley water, made by simmering barley grains in water and straining out the liquid, carries a small amount of magnesium and complex carbohydrate into the water itself, and it's been used as a mild hydrating drink across the Mediterranean and Middle East for centuries, long before sports drinks existed in any modern form. Barley itself runs throughout the Bible, most famously as part of the boys' lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fish, that Jesus used to feed a crowd of 5,000 in John chapter 6, and again in the story of Ruth, gleaning through a barley field during harvest season under Boaz's protection. Barley water specifically isn't named in scripture, but it's a well-documented use of the same grain across the same region over a very long stretch of history, worth being upfront about since not every entry on this list is a direct textual reference. To make it, simmer a 1/4 cup of barley in 4 cups of water for 20 minutes, strain, and drink warm or chilled, saving the softened grains themselves to add to a soup or salad later. Let's move from a grain turned into water to a fruit dried and soaked to make one instead. Number 15. Fig-soaked water. Dried figs release a meaningful amount of potassium and calcium into water when left to soak. A simple, low-effort way to add minerals to a glass of water without any cooking, straining, or special equipment involved at all, making this one of the easiest entries on this entire list to actually keep up with on a regular basis. Figs hold the distinction of being the very first plant named specifically in the Bible, used by Adam and Eve to cover themselves in the Garden of Eden, and the fig tree goes on to become one of Scripture's most recurring symbols of peace and provision, repeated in the phrase, about sitting under one's own vine and fig tree in safety. Soak 2 or 3 dried figs in a glass of water overnight in the refrigerator, then drink the water and eat the softened figs afterward, nothing wasted in either direction. The longer they sit, the more pronounced the flavor becomes. So, adjusting the soaking time to taste is worth experimenting with over a few attempts. From one soaked dried fruit, let's move to another, with an even more dramatic backstory attached to it. Number 14. Raisin-soaked water. Raisins concentrate potassium and polyphenols during the drying process. Since removing the water leaves nearly everything else behind in a much smaller volume, and soaking them releases much of that concentrated content into the water itself, giving you a mildly sweet, mineral-rich drink without needing to eat a large handful of dried fruit directly. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, Abigail rushes to intercept David with a peace offering that includes raisins among the provisions, alongside bread, wine, roasted grain, and fig cakes, part of a gesture that ultimately prevents a violent confrontation after her husband Nabal's foolish insult toward David's men out in the field, where they had spent months protecting his flocks without asking for anything in return. A small handful, soaked in water overnight and strained the next morning, gives you a naturally sweet, potassium-rich drink. The leftover raisins are still perfectly good to eat afterward, just slightly milder in flavor than before soaking. Golden raisins and dark raisins both work equally well for this, so whichever is already in the pantry is a fine place to start. Let's move from a dried fruit to the fresh version of the same plant, prepared in a completely different way. Number 13. New wine. Grapes carry a solid amount of potassium, and new wine, grape juice in its earliest, barely fermented state, would have delivered that mineral in a form far closer to fresh juice than to the wine sold in stores today, since fermentation had only just begun rather than running its full course over months. Jesus references new wine directly in Matthew chapter 9, explaining that new wine needs new wineskins because the ongoing fermentation would burst an old, less flexible skin, a detail that tells us new wine was understood as an actively changing, living drink rather than a finished product, ready to be bottled and stored. The comparison itself was meant to illustrate something else entirely, about new teaching needing room to grow. But the practical detail behind it reveals exactly how this particular drink was actually made and handled at the time. The modern equivalent is simply fresh, unfiltered grape juice, ideally with minimal added sugar, which delivers the potassium without the alcohol or concentrated sugar of a fully fermented, aged wine sitting on a shelf for years. Cloudy, unfiltered varieties tend to retain more of the grape's natural nutrients than the clear, heavily filtered juice most commonly sold in supermarkets. From a drink still actively changing in its skin, let's move to something pulled straight from a pot of simmering meat. Number 12. Gideon's broth. Broth made from simmered meat is naturally rich in sodium and potassium, along with smaller amounts of other minerals that leach out of both the meat and any bones included during a long simmer, making it one of the more genuinely mineral-dense liquids on this entire list, rather than just flavored water dressed up to look more substantial than it actually is. In Judges chapter 6, Gideon prepares a meal for a visitor he doesn't yet realize is an angel, cooking a young goat and placing the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, presenting both separately as an offering, only for the angel to touch the food with his staff and consume it in fire before Gideon's eyes. A moment that finally convinces Gideon of exactly who he's been speaking with all along. Modern bone broth, simmered for several hours rather than a shorter cooking time, concentrates even more of these minerals into the liquid, making a warm cup of it a genuinely useful source of sodium and potassium together, especially in colder weather, when a cold drink holds less appeal than something steaming. A small amount of vinegar added at the start of the simmer helps draw even more minerals out of the bones themselves over that longer cooking time. Let's move from a pot of broth to a much larger, much more famous supply of water in the middle of nowhere. Number 11. Water from the rock. Plain water remains the foundation everything else on this list builds on top of. Since no amount of added minerals matters if the basic fluid intake isn't there to begin with, and dehydration itself disrupts the very electrolyte balance. This whole video is about making everything downstream harder for the body to manage. In Exodus chapter 17, the Israelites arrive in the wilderness with no water at all, afraid enough to argue with Moses about it and question whether God is even among them anymore, and God instructs him to strike a specific rock in front of the elders, water pouring out for the entire community and their animals. The location itself is later named for the arguing and testing that happened there, a detail the text takes care to preserve rather than gloss over. There's no preparation tip needed here beyond the obvious one. Consistent water intake spread throughout the day, rather than large amounts all at once, keeps this foundation steady and gives the body a fair chance to actually absorb what it's given, rather than simply passing it through too quickly to matter. From plain water, let's move to the fruit that gave water its first real flavor upgrade on this entire list. Number 10. Diluted grape juice. Grape juice carries potassium and polyphenols, but at full strength, it's concentrated enough in sugar that diluting it with water, roughly 1 part juice to 2 or 3 parts water, delivers the minerals without the same sugar load. A full glass of straight juice would bring to your bloodstream all at once, a simple adjustment that changes very little about the flavor, while changing quite a bit about the overall effect. In Numbers chapter 13, spies scouting the promised land return with a cluster of grapes so large it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole between them, offered as proof of the land's fertility to a nervous, hesitant nation still uncertain about entering territory they'd never actually seen with their own eyes. 10 of the 12 spies still come back, discouraged despite the evidence in front of them, a detail that makes the grapes themselves almost beside the point compared to how differently people can interpret the exact same proof. This diluted approach, sometimes called a spritzer when sparkling water is used instead of still, is a simple way to stretch the mineral benefit of juice across a larger volume of actual fluid rather than concentrating it into one small, sugary glass. Let's move to a version of this same idea that shows up in one of the more romantic passages in the entire Bible. Number 9. Spiced pomegranate wine. Pomegranate juice combines potassium with punic halogens, some of the most concentrated antioxidant compounds found in any fruit, a combination that shows up in exactly this pairing, wine and pomegranate juice together, in one of the more tender, intimate passages in all of Scripture. In Song of Solomon, chapter 8, the bride describes wanting to bring her beloved into her mother's house and give him spiced wine made from the juice of her own pomegranates, an image of intimacy and generous hospitality rather than anything ceremonial or ritualistic, a private gesture between two people rather than a public offering. The verse comes near the very end of the book, part of a closing declaration of devotion rather than an early, tentative moment between the couple. A modern, non-alcoholic version simply combines pomegranate juice with a bit of warm spice like cinnamon, no wine required to capture the same flavor pairing or the same mineral content. The verse describes warming it gently on the stove rather than serving it cold, brings out the spice more fully, and makes for a comforting drink on a cooler evening. From a spiced version of this fruit, let's move to the plain juice on its own. Number 8. Diluted pomegranate juice. On its own, without the spiced wine, pomegranate juice still delivers a meaningful dose of potassium, and diluting it the same way as grape juice keeps the natural sugar from overwhelming the mineral benefit it otherwise brings to the table. The same simple principle applied consistently across nearly every juice on this list. Pomegranates carried enough symbolic weight to be embroidered directly onto the hem of the high priest's ceremonial robe in Exodus chapter 28, alternating with small golden bells, a level of importance given to very few plants anywhere in Scripture, chosen deliberately over countless other fruits available at the time, for a garment meant to represent the entire nation before God. Fresh pressed and diluted with water, roughly half and half, is closer to how the fruit's juice would have been used in the ancient world than the heavily processed, often sugar-added versions sold in bottles today at most grocery stores. Rolling the fruit firmly on a counter before cutting it open makes extracting the seeds and juice considerably easier than starting from a whole, unrolled pomegranate. Let's move from a sweet drink to one with the sharpest flavor on this entire list. Number 7. Vinegar drink. Plain vinegar diluted with water was such a standard drink in the ancient world that Roman soldiers carried rations of it specifically because it traveled well, resisted spoiling on long campaigns, and, with a pinch of salt added, functioned as a genuinely practical way to stay hydrated during long marches through hot terrain. Ruth is invited to dip her bread in vinegar during a meal, in Ruth chapter 2, offered directly by Boaz as an act of kindness toward a foreign widow with almost nothing to her name. And centuries later, that same basic drink, sour wine or vinegar mixed with water, is what's offered to Jesus during the crucifixion in Matthew chapter 27, a detail historians connect directly to this common Roman ration known as posca, likely what the soldiers on guard duty were drinking themselves that day. A modern version, a tablespoon of vinegar in a glass of water with a small pinch of salt, is sharp but genuinely functional, closer to what soldiers on both sides of that ancient world would have actually been drinking day to day than to anything found in a modern grocery store. Apple cider vinegar tends to be gentler on the palate than plain white vinegar, if the sharpness alone is off-putting at first. From the sharpest drink on this list, let's move to one of the gentlest, and one shared with 3 unexpected guests. Number 6. Milk. Milk delivers calcium, potassium, and sodium together in a single drink, making it one of the more nutritionally complete entries on this entire list, rather than offering just one mineral at a time, the way most individual foods and drinks tend to. A rare case of one ordinary beverage doing the work of three separate ingredients. In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham rushes to prepare a meal of curds, milk, and freshly cooked meat for three visitors who turn out to be messengers of God, offering it as an act of immediate, generous hospitality to strangers passing through his camp in the heat of the day, without knowing anything about who they actually were. At the time, he first ran out to greet them: plain milk, dairy, or a fortified plant. Alternative, if dairy doesn't agree with you, remains one of the simplest ways to get 3 electrolytes in one glass without any preparation, beyond pouring it straight from the carton. Checking the label on a plant-based alternative matters here specifically, since not all of them are fortified with the same calcium and potassium levels. Dairy milk naturally carries. Now for the drink we promised you at the very beginning of this video. Number 5. Water at MARAH. Here's the story we teased earlier. 3 days into the wilderness after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites find water at a place called MARAH, only to discover it's too bitter to drink. A devastating discovery for a group already desperate with thirst after days without a reliable source. In Exodus chapter 15, Moses cries out to God, and he's shown a specific piece of wood which he throws into the water, and it becomes drinkable. It's one of the very first crises the newly freed nation faces: water they could see but couldn't use. Arguably more frustrating than having no water in sight at all after everything they'd already survived, just getting that far. The place is named MARAH, meaning bitter, a name that stuck permanently even after the water itself was made sweet. There's no clear modern recipe to take from this one. The lesson is really about the difference between water simply being present and water actually being usable by the body, a distinction that still matters today whenever water is contaminated or otherwise unsafe to drink directly, regardless of how plentiful it looks on the surface. Boiling, filtering, or otherwise treating questionable water before drinking it remains the modern version of that same basic principle. From bitter water made drinkable, let's move to one of the sweetest, most mineral-dense fruits on this entire list. Number 4. Date water. Dates are one of the more concentrated potassium sources on this entire list, and simmering or soaking them in water transfers a meaningful amount of that mineral directly into the liquid, along with a gentle, natural sweetness that needs nothing else added to taste good. Dates are almost certainly the honey behind the phrase describing the promised land as flowing with milk and honey in Deuteronomy. Chapter 8. Since date syrup was a far more common, accessible sweetener in daily life than wild bee honey ever was for most ordinary households across the region who had no reliable way to safely harvest honey from a wild hive. Simmer 4 or 5 pitted dates in 2 cups of water for 10 minutes, mash them slightly, and strain. What's left is a naturally sweet, potassium-rich base that also happens to be the starting point for the recipe waiting at the very end of this video. Medjool dates work particularly well here, given how soft and syrupy they already are before any cooking even begins. Let's combine 2 entries from this list into a single drink that brings together 3 separate electrolytes at once. Number 3. Yogurt, date, and salt smoothie. Blending yogurt with dates and a small pinch of salt brings together calcium, potassium, and sodium in a single drink, essentially combining 2 earlier entries on this list into one genuinely complete electrolyte source, rather than relying on any single ingredient alone to do all the work. 3 minerals working through 3 slightly different mechanisms, all arriving in the same glass. This one is a modern recipe rather than a direct biblical reference, but every ingredient in it, curds, date syrup, salt, appears throughout Scripture individually, from Abraham's hospitality in Genesis to the promised land described in Deuteronomy, making it a fair, honest combination of ideas that already existed separately. Blend a cup of plain yogurt with 2 pitted dates, a small pinch of salt, and enough water to reach a drinkable consistency. It's filling enough to work as a light meal on its own, rather than just a beverage to sip alongside something else, especially useful on a morning when there isn't time to sit down for a full breakfast. Let's move to a simpler, more traditional version of that same basic combination. Number 2. AYRAN-STYLE yogurt drink. This next drink strips the previous entry down to its simplest, most traditional form: plain yogurt, thinned with water, and a pinch of salt, nothing else added. A preparation still made across the Middle East today, essentially unchanged for thousands of years, under a variety of different regional names. The curds Abraham served his 3 visitors in Genesis chapter 18 would very plausibly have been thinned and diluted this exact way when the goal was drinking rather than eating, since fresh dairy in a hot climate needed to be used quickly, in whatever form made the most sense for that particular day and occasion, long before refrigeration made storing it. For later, a realistic option: whisk a cup of plain yogurt with an equal amount of cold water and a small pinch of salt until smooth. It's tangy, refreshing, and, unlike most commercial sports drinks, contains genuine calcium alongside its sodium and potassium, rather than relying on artificial coloring and flavoring to carry the whole experience. Served over ice on a hot afternoon, it does essentially the same job a bright blue sports drink claims to, just with a much shorter ingredient list. Which brings us to number 1, and the drink recipe closest to an actual medical formula on this entire list. Number 1. Homemade ORS. Here's the drink we promised you at the very start. The World Health Organization's oral rehydration solution, one of the most significant public health interventions of the last century, credited with cutting child deaths from diarrheal disease dramatically worldwide, is built from exactly 3 ingredients: water, a small amount of sugar, and a small amount of salt, in a specific ratio that allows the body to absorb sodium and fluid together far more efficiently than water alone ever could. The mechanism behind it is called sodium-glucose cotransport. When sugar and sodium are present together in the gut in the right proportion, the intestine absorbs both, and water follows right along with them, which is precisely why plain water by itself can actually struggle to rehydrate someone who's lost a significant amount of fluid and salt at the same time, such as through heavy sweating, vomiting, or illness. Without that sugar present to help drive the process, a meaningful portion of the sodium and water can simply pass through the gut, largely unabsorbed. Date syrup, the very sweetener behind the honey, in the Promised Land's description in Deuteronomy chapter 8, happens to provide both natural sugar and potassium at once, making it a remarkably fitting base for a homemade version of this exact concept. Thousands of years before anyone understood the sodium-glucose mechanism behind why it actually works at all. A simple version: 1 liter of water, 2 tablespoons of date syrup, and a half teaspoon of salt, stirred until fully dissolved. This is a wellness recipe for general hydration, not a medical treatment. If you're dealing with actual illness-related dehydration, a doctor or a proper oral rehydration product with a tested, precise formula is the right call. But for everyday hydration, particularly after sweating heavily through exercise or hot weather. It's a genuinely evidence-informed way to help water actually stay where your body needs it, instead of passing straight through. Keeping a batch in the refrigerator during warmer months makes it easy to reach for without measuring everything out fresh each time. 17 drinks, and one consistent idea running underneath all of them. Water alone isn't always enough. A little sodium, a little potassium, a little natural sugar is often what actually helps your body hold on to the fluid you're drinking in the first place. If one of these finds its way into your routine this week, especially that last one, that's a genuine win. Which one are you trying first? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.